I'm about to talk about Jesus and Trump. So I'm going to break both rules. I'm going to get into both religion and politics and get kicked out of the family Thanksgiving dinner. And as I'm being dragged out, what I'm going to suggest is that we need to stop believing that any external savior is going to save us in this life. And instead, we need to identify ourselves as the heroes we've been waiting for. And we need to then accept the responsibility to create the world we want to see. So, as I've stated already, I'm a recovered atheist. I was basically an atheist for many years. Definitely not a Christian, and didn't believe in a literal, historical, fundamentalist take on the Bible. And by the way, I still don't. And I felt a little suspicious of people that did believe those things. How could I fully trust someone when it appears that they're living in a kind of disconnect? A disconnect from reality with one foot in this world and one foot in this kind of like fantasy. And yet, at some times in my life, when I've been on the front lines of some kind of fight, some sort of fight for freedom or truth, I often find myself surrounded by Christians. And so I've had to admit that it seems to give people a strength to do courageous things. Now, seeing the support for Trump from people that have a very strictly literal interpretation of Jesus, I'm now seeing that I was kind of correct, that I couldn't quite trust these people. Because look, the same victim mentality that causes people to latch onto Jesus as their savior, that is going to come down and, fix everything. That's the kind of mentality that people are now applying to Donald Trump. You see, many Christians truly believe that someday Jesus is going to return and kind of reign for 1,000 years and save us from this insanity. At least save the believers. And I know people who basically have given up trying to change anything and instead are simply waiting for Jesus to come fix things. And that may only be a small percentage of Christians that are that disempowered, but it is kind of an accepted tenet of Christianity, as far as I understand, that Jesus, yes, is going to return. And, that's what they're looking forward to. And that underlying faith in a savior that's going to come fix everything, that's what's going on with Trump. And the reason I know this is because of the amount of Christians who are currently backing Trump. And, don't get it twisted. I don't mean to say you should have voted the other way, okay? In fact, let me get into my own personal journey with Donald Trump because it's a bit interesting. In 2016, when he first started running, I barely knew who he was. I'm not into pop culture. I never really was. I didn't watch any of his shows. He wasn't on my radar. But being a radical left activist at the time, I quickly came to see him as the epitome of fascism and patriarchy and everything we were against. And so when he won, I was shocked. I was like, how could this happen? How could so many people have voted for him? And that's funny because flash forward 4 years in 2020, at that point, I was a completely different person. I had come to realize that the radical left was completely wrong on many critical issues. And I found out after questioning these things that it was kind of a cult. And many people are simply unable to question the official dogma. So, coming out of that, I was naturally drifting into more conservative channels and people, and I started to see the flip side of how people saw Trump. That they perceive him as this someone who basically just doesn't give a fuck about political correctness and was sort of calling out the bullshit that was becoming normal in our culture. And the media, I was seeing that the media would cherry pick things out of context and manipulate the story to make him appear as a villain. But it just depended on which side you were looking at, or, from which angle you were looking at. So anyway, at the time, I was actually supporting Trump in 2020. And, that's a pretty radical change, right? From where I had been 4 years before that. And by the way, it seemed at the time that there was all these shenanigans in the elections in 2020. And so I was following all that drama very closely, the lawsuits, Sidney Powell, all those characters. I was full on living the drama in that whole storyline of that whole episode. Now, after 2020, I continued to learn and realize more of the deceptions, and I've changed how I see things. I have a deeper understanding of how the deceptions in this world operate. And let me tell you, I've known that Trump is not actually our savior for years at this point. And it's only getting more obvious. I cannot go into the specifics right now of all the reasons I know this, that he's simply a puppet controlled by our enemy. We'll get into that in another video. But for now, the assumption is that he is 100% a controlled actor, okay? And that goes, by the way, for any of the other actors up there on that stage. And I'm talking RFK Jr., I'm talking Elon Musk. I honestly can't understand how intelligent people who see through some of the propaganda cannot see through that. The media, the judges, the deep state all being opposed to Donald Trump, and yet he's still president again all these years later. All that opposition is just part of the narrative to make you think that he's up against the odds and he's legit, and you can see how well that worked. And this is exactly what people before us have tried to warn us about, that our enemies control the opposition. That is what they always do. They control the leadership on both sides, and they script the story. There are no outsiders that come in and become presidents. That doesn't happen. Maybe it did, in the 1800s or something, but for many decades that has not been the case. The presidents in this country are selected, and the people who are the puppet masters are masters of mind control. And so that's what they've done. You see, in our time right now, there were so many people waking up and seeing through the propaganda and discovering the truth about certain deceptions that they had to do something with all that energy. And so they redirected into these leaders that they have control over. So then they control that whole opposition. And people actually believe that Trump is on their side, and that the dream team of RFK Jr. and Elon Musk, they're going to shake things up in Washington. And that's, it's not just Christians that are falling for that, but it gets into that problem with Christianity as it's understood by many Christians. And Christianity, as I was saying in another video, it's meant to be a way to connect us to the divine. So we become the hero, we activate our Christ consciousness, we recognize that we are a child of God and that we must manifest in this realm, in our life, to the best of our ability, what we want to see. And instead, people are either waiting on Jesus to come back or waiting on Trump and RFK Jr. to fix things, when it's quite obvious that both of those are disempowering. And actually that the root of all this is this victim mentality, when what we need is a hero mentality. Because when you have that, you can let go of this idea that Trump is on your side fighting for you. Because he's not, and it honestly should be obvious at this point. The reason people are not snapping out of that spell is because they desperately need him as their savior. Because without him, what do we do? Well, I'll tell you what we do. We pick up our sword and we slay some dragons.